Hi, welcome to the latest module, Module 4, in Mass Media and American Politics here at Sacramento State in the fall of 2020. I forget what year it is. So I'm your instructor, Daniel Kirsch, and today we're going to be talking about campaign advertising and Chapter 6 specifically. Before I do that, I should just reorient everyone that in this module we'll be talking about primarily presidential campaign advertising, as you'll see in a minute. We're also going to be referencing some statewide advertising in California and in other work. And also we're going to be going down the list of what a typical campaign strategy is. And so your job is to, from the information that I give you today, as well as from the textbook where most of it's from, you're going to be asked to sort of evaluate the information on your own and try to answer some of the questions that are in your syllabus and in the assignment for the module essay. So this will be the last module essay that's really part of the syllabus. After this, we're going to be moving into peer review and then looking at your research paper proposal once again. So to start off today, I thought it was necessary to kind of orient us that I drew up a little bit of the topics that should make more sense as we move through them. But this should be an exhaustive list of what I think we're going to be able to talk about today. For the most part, we're going to be talking about historical, again, presidential election campaigns, but we're also going to be looking at some California examples, which should be interesting. And they're interesting not only because of their tie to a lot of these strategies that are used by American presidential candidates, but also because of the modern relevance that they have. So the fact that I think it makes a big difference, actually, that the author of the textbook is a Stanford University professor. So he seems to bring a lot of knowledge about California historical campaigns for governor. And finally, I'll be bringing in a little bit of my own work that actually was related to some of this. But I'm also going to be steering you towards some of the ongoing campaign advertisements that are available on the course website through the publisher, through Norton. So to start off with some of the fundamentals that every campaign is after. Every campaign is basically trying to do three things in trying to get their candidate elected. And those fundamentals are exploiting the press coverage as best they can, knowing that the news media is always going to be covering them. They seek to have the best advantage they can in making that coverage as plentiful and as positive as possible. And different presidential campaigns, all of these that I'm listing have been victorious presidential campaigns. So we can kind of draw from the successes of them and see what they did that maybe innovated on other presidential campaigns. There's also a limit to that free media. That is what it's often called in media analysis. Free media is the media that campaigns don't have to pay for. It's the coverage that they get through the news media that they're going to cover anyway. But advertising is most certainly what they do pay for. And I put negative advertising up there because most of the time, a lot of the historical campaign coverage anyway has focused on negative advertising, and rightly so. It is a growing portion of overall campaign advertising. It started out in the 1960s. There's a chart, I believe, on early in the chapter. I don't have the page notated, but it's it started out as around 10% of television ads were negative, and now it's up to, I think, over 50% now of campaign ads are actually, strictly speaking, negative ads. And so this turns a lot of people off, I think, to politics. But the more important thing that it does, at least in the short term, is it turns people off to the opponent that it's targeting. and that's the aim of it. And so people use it, or candidates use it, I should say, because it works. And these strategies, as distasteful to the public as they may be, it really gets you mobilized, or at least gets a lot of people mobilized historically, to go vote against the other candidate instead of voting for the candidate that's paying for the advertisement. And finally, there's something called that you'll hear referenced in a lot of press coverage, and you might have even heard it in the recent presidential debate that occurred between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and it's called the expectations game. And it's called the expectations game because essentially their public relations team in every presidential campaign is basically lying. They're doing their best to set expectations as low as possible, whether it's a debate or it's a convention, or whether it's polling and how well a candidate is doing. And if they set expectations low and then they meet or exceed those expectations, they're able to spin it as a win and positive and unexpected. So if they keep expectations low, they can always meet them. And this has gone to some absurd lengths that the textbook does a really good job of documenting, because it's just the level of absurdity and the level of lying, and the level of back and forth that is setting the bar impossibly low, makes it so that almost any candidate could meet those expectations. So, and there's a reason for that. And as I said, you can always meet them, but also, in a debate, there's no win except who's persuaded to go and vote for that person or against that person as a result of the debate. So there's no points, there's no winning. It's just beating expectations and kind of winning the ensuing press coverage. And of course, the ongoing kind of ad war. So what I thought we could do is kind of do something that the book doesn't do, and really go through kind of campaign by campaign what the three components of all of these campaigns were doing. And I guess I'm going to be drawing on not only what's in the textbook, but also my own knowledge of these campaigns, and but again, most of it will be from at least referencing the textbook. So to start off with, and let's see if we can kind of check some of these boxes as we go. So to kind of set the scene, in 1976, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were squaring off in the first post-Watergate election. So Ford had been the first post-Watergate presidential election. There had been congressional elections in 1974. But Ford had been president for about 2 years at this point. He was never elected. He was the first appointed vice president, who then became the first president who was never elected as vice president in the first place. And so he was running against Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. And Gerald Ford, was known as a really well-respected and moderate Republican from Michigan in Congress. And so he had been kind of a national player to a certain degree, but he had been the leader of the Republicans in the House. But he had never, he hadn't been exposed really to everyone in the U.S. And during this debate that was held by, maybe the last debate, I think, that was held by the League of Women Voters, which was still exists, a nonpartisan group that seeks to, promote voting in general. And anyway, so they held this debate, and the campaigns were not in control of it. But Ford was asked a question in which he decided that he would assert really vigorously that there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And from the context, I feel like I could kind of get what he was saying, or at least what he was trying to say. But I'm just trying to be generous, because it really was kind of ridiculous, because everyone knew that the Soviet Union was the military and economic and political overlord, really, of all of those Warsaw Pact countries at the time during the Cold War. So that's Poland and Hungary, and at the time Czechoslovakia, and to a certain degree Yugoslavia, but all of those countries that were, including East Germany, but including East Germany and everything east all the way to the Soviet Union itself, was really politically controlled by the Soviet Union. And it was sort of an offhand comment about Jimmy Carter, that it was sort of taken as a given. But Gerald Ford decided to say there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. He said it during the questions, and then he said it in his summary statement. And it's kind of known as one of the most overt gaffes, the most obvious kind of like mistakes that a presidential candidate or president at the time could make in a debate. So it was a factual error that he doubled down on. And so that was interesting. And so I think he walked it back later. I'm not sure. Maybe he didn't. I wasn't born yet. I don't know. But that was kind of, so he lost that election very narrowly. I think he lost it 49-48, and only by a slight margin in a couple Midwestern states, if that sounds familiar. But Jimmy Carter won. And so he was defending his championship title, as it were, in 1980, and Reagan was his challenger, the former governor of California. And Reagan asked a very pointed question during the debates, and that was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And this was depicted in the textbook, at least, as the kind of very obvious or overt, call to people measuring their own economic well-being against, the record of the incumbent. And so incumbency has its advantages, but one of them is a decided disadvantage if there's a recession, or if there's any kind of any kind of hardship that people are undergoing generally during the re-election campaign of that incumbent. Reagan did a great job of exploiting the press and press management. He was not only did he have a career in show business and in union politics, but also he had been statewide. He had gotten a lot of experience, after being an actor and being a union politician, who incidentally was one of the people who kind of encouraged people to name names during the Red Scare. But he, as governor of California, he learned how to sort of make a splash and all kinds of things. So he came on the national stage, and he was able to make his identity known as the great communicator, that the press really nicknamed him. And he used the charisma that he brought to the debate stage, to making speeches, and to kind of his folksy demeanor, was really effective at selling whatever platform he was running on. And it's almost as if this was one of the first really modern campaigns that was able to fully grasp what Roger Ailes' prediction was all those years before. Roger Ailes, the deceased Fox News president, who had been a Republican campaign consultant. He said that, they're all going to have to be showmen. That's it. After 1968, he saw, it's all TV all the time, and presidents are no longer going to have to be typical politicians. They can come out of nowhere and be showmen. And obviously that's what Reagan was, at least in part. I'm just saying that was a strength of his. And did he manage his debate expectations? There's not a lot of that in the textbook, but they didn't really need to. He was sort of an unknown, and I think that he probably, the managing expectations game didn't really exist yet. But to the extent that he was able to exploit the unexpected, in debates, he did a great job of that with the "Are you, better off than you were 4 years ago?" quote. But then again, in 1984, he had some notable. He had been, first of all, he had been shot. He had gotten an assassination attempt that he survived that boosted his popularity tremendously, and his health and he recovered fully, and everyone was rooting for him. But he made kind of a I don't recall it at the time. I don't recall it right now. But he made some kind of gaffe in I think the first debate or the first half of the debate against his challenger Walter Mondale from Minnesota in 1984, the former vice president under Carter, and he said something about I'm not going to make age an issue in this campaign. Because he had made this gaffe that made a lot of people start to talk about, his fitness for office and whether he was kind of developing, in his older age, if he was developing any kind of cognitive disability. And he said, I'm not going to make age an issue in this campaign. I won't exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience for political gain. I think that's almost an exact quote. And people roared with laughter at the time, like in the studio, and even made his opponent, Walter Mondale, chuckle, who was, in his mid-40s or something, and Reagan was 73, I think. So there's a big 30-year gap between them, and Reagan managed to just turn it around and call his opponent young and inexperienced, kind of like deflecting it and almost nullifying it as a campaign issue. So from then on, he wasn't really attacked, at least effectively, during that campaign. Later on, it was seen that he developed Alzheimer's. We're not sure when, but in 1994, he revealed it in his last public speech. So anyway, that's what gets us to 1988. And who rises in 1988 but George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. And George Herbert Walker Bush was, everyone knows he was kind of a patrician. He was someone who came from a family that was somewhat aristocratic, two families that were somewhat aristocratic. And the Bushes were an oil kind of scion family, and he also just, was apparently a distant relative of some British monarchs, so that would make his son that as well. His father was one of the people who was a senator from Connecticut. His father, Prescott Bush, was one of the people who persuaded Dwight D. Eisenhower to run for president in 1952 when he was president of Columbia University after World War II. And so he was not an apolitical person, and in his first campaign for Congress in Texas, after he had moved there as an adult, after serving in World War II and going to all these prep schools and going to Yale, and he was very, he's seen as kind of an upper class individual in terms of if you think in terms of class. And so he's got a lot of money, and he's in his first campaign, I believe in 1964, he made and this is not in the book, he talked quite a bit about his opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which at the time, hadn't been passed yet, but it was, that was really the first really watershed moment for the Republican Party to assume the role of really conservatism on issues of race. So they didn't feel that there was a place for government to step in to enforce racial equality. And this was really at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and after segregation had reigned for the better part of a century in the South. And here was George H.W. Bush, a transplant from the North, who was trying to run for office in the South, and he ran for Congress, I believe, one time unsuccessfully, and then I think he served 2 terms in the House. And then later on, he never was elected to another office before running against Reagan in 1980 and then running as his vice president. But he was the CIA director, and he was the chairman of the Republican Party under Nixon. So he was an experienced politician, and he he kind of had a strategy by the time 1988 came around, and um, it was to try to duplicate Reagan's strategy. And there was one part that I skipped over. Um, Several parts I skipped over in Reagan's strategy. But one strategy that's really the overarching strategy that you should know in 1984 was Reagan was okay. There are two. Reagan was going back and saying that look, the economy's good. Remember I asked that question, if you're better off than you were 4 years ago? Well, now I'm really asking it again, and I'm going to call this, or my advertising firm is going to call this, Morning in America. And I really urge you to watch the ad. I'll provide a link to it. It's considered maybe the most genius, or classic at least, incumbent ad during good economic times in American political history. It's just such an unbelievably, sentimental ad of these kind of Norman Rockwell-esque video images and of people in a small town and good weather and hoisting an American flag in their front yard and all kinds of things like that. I can't remember if I don't know that there were really any people of color in that ad. That'd be interesting to go back and look, but I don't think there were. So I think everyone was white. But either way, it was very successful, and so that was one part of his strategy. The other part was just exploiting fear and wedge issues about the Soviet Union, and they did that subtly. And one way they did that was through this one ad that said there's a bear, stalking the woods, and it was just the whole commercial. The whole ad is just a bear walking around and being narrated as this menacing, monster. And it's supposed to be referencing, of course, the Russian bear, or just the Soviet Union as a threat, and showing that Reagan is the one who's conscious of this bear and is, got an eye on this bear and is definitely going to keep you safe from this bear. So it's all very psychological and negative, and like Ale said, really just showmanship. And so that worked. And so that two-part strategy is what Reagan continued to employ really during his presidency to try to sell his policy agenda. But it was all just sort of a takeoff from his campaign. And so when Bush came into the scene really as the national Republican leader, or at least the successor to Reagan, because Reagan was limited by the 22nd Amendment to not run for a third term. So Bush was running for office against some Republican challengers, of course. One thing that this doesn't actually quite reference is you may know of Bob Dole, who was the 1996 Republican nominee. He was a senator from Kansas, longtime Senate Majority Leader, and he was he was a moderate Republican as well, and he was running against George H.W. Bush for the presidential nomination in 1988. He had been the running mate to Gerald Ford in 1976. So this was only 8 years later. And so there was a moment, and I only know this really from reading Dole's autobiography many years ago. It probably may have been ghostwritten, but either way. Actually, it was a joint It was a joint autobiography with himself and his wife, Elizabeth, who later ran for president herself. In any event, Dole was somewhat disabled. He was someone who he held a pen in, I believe, his right hand all the time because he had suffered a really terrible war wound while an officer in the Army in World War II. And so he really couldn't move, and again, I can't remember which hand, but he really couldn't move his entire arm, much like John McCain in 2000 and 2008. And George H.W. Bush chose to, and there's no way to know if this is premeditated or not, but his campaign thought it would be good for him while campaigning in New Hampshire for the Republican primary, for when there was a snowstorm, for George H.W. Bush to be seen out shoveling snow, which is something I'm sure he didn't do at home, For one thing, he lived in Texas, but another, he typically is not, he might have hired someone to do that. But Bob Dole couldn't do things like shovel snow. And so it was, so if it was premeditated, then it was certainly a pretty cynical, attack subtly on the physical fortitude of Bob Dole. And so, I think Dole essentially said that it was all was fair, but perhaps I don't remember the tone in which he presented it, but seeing that recounted definitely seemed to make a difference and leave some kind of leave an impression on him. So in 1988, further, it's really notable so he's able to get this nomination, and he continues the kind of attack on law and order that had been a Republican hallmark really throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so he continues this, and he really only ends up winning with only one group demographically. About 25 to 30% of the electorate were white evangelical Christians. And so he was able to win an outright majority of those folks by a margin of something like 80%. But he lost to Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. He lost the majority votes of women, of African Americans, as all Republicans have. And he also lost the votes of young people, and he lost the votes of every other group that you can name. But he won with just really widespread support from white evangelical Christians. And part of the way he may have done that is in 1988, he was running a campaign that was trailing, actually, after he achieved the nomination. He was trailing Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who I guess I'll name as one of the three. Have I met four governors? I've met four governors, and he was one of them. Let's see. So Michael Dukakis was the Massachusetts governor, and he was running, I think, 17 points ahead of Bush at the time. And Dukakis was the governor of this state and had been a governor, I think, for 3 terms, maybe, at this point. And so everything that was in Massachusetts was sort of fair game, including this policy that allowed for a rare furlough to a criminal, a violent criminal, whose name was William Horton. And Horton, while on a furlough from a Massachusetts state prison, and because he was serving a sentence for some violent crime, I don't remember, but while he was on a furlough, he escaped from Massachusetts, traveled to Maryland, and assaulted a couple in Maryland. And his mugshot, Horton's mugshot, was used in an ad that at the time the Bush campaign claimed did not come from its campaign. Later on, this is an extraordinary story that maybe I'll just provide a clip for. But his campaign consultant at the time was this young man named Lee Atwater. And they claimed that it didn't come from them, but later on, in the next, I think less than 4 or 5 years later, Lee Atwater developed a really debilitating brain tumor that caused him to kind of confess in an editorial in one of his dying days in the Wall Street Journal that in fact it was the Bush campaign that put the ad out that talked about how Willie Horton was let out on a weekend pass because of Michael Dukakis. And so that ad and another ad that went with it, because of the mugshot, were seen as